The high-stakes hearing between Representative Jasmine Crockett and FBI Director Kash Patel serves as a definitive flashpoint in the ongoing struggle over the soul of American federal law enforcement. This confrontation transcends mere political theater as it encapsulates a fundamental disagreement regarding the institutional design and the constitutional boundaries of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When Crockett leveled her accusations of incompetence against Patel, she was not simply attacking his resume but challenging the very legitimacy of his appointment within a traditionally non-partisan framework. Her rhetoric underscored a deep-seated anxiety among legislative overseers that the agency might be drifting away from its historical moorings toward a more personality-driven model of governance. The tension in the room was palpable as two distinct visions of American justice collided in a public forum designed for accountability and rigorous scrutiny. The discourse surrounding Patel's leadership often centers on his lack of a conventional path through the ranks of the Department of Justice or the Bureau itself. To his critics, this void in traditional experience represents a dangerous vulnerability that could undermine the complex operational integrity required to lead thousands of special agents and analysts. Crockett's assertion that Patel is the least qualified leader in the agency's storied history reflects a broader institutionalist perspective that values tenure and procedural expertise above political alignment. This viewpoint suggests that the FBI requires a steward who understands the granular mechanics of counterintelligence and federal criminal investigations rather than a political disruptor. However, the debate remains polarized because what one side views as a lack of qualifications, the other characterizes as a necessary break from a stagnant bureaucracy. Central to the heated exchange was the allegation that loyalty to the executive branch has superseded the impartial application of the rule of law. This specific point of contention strikes at the heart of the post-Watergate consensus, which sought to insulate the FBI from direct political interference by the White House. Crockett's line of questioning suggested that the current leadership is prioritizing the personal and political objectives of Donald Trump over the objective mandates of justice. Such accusations raise significant questions about the long-term health of democratic institutions when the line between law enforcement and political advocacy becomes increasingly blurred. The fear articulated by the Congresswoman is that a partisan FBI could be utilized to settle political scores rather than to protect the citizenry from objective threats. In response to these pointed critiques, Director Patel maintained a posture of defiance, framing his leadership as a return to core law enforcement values that resonate with the American public. He deliberately pivoted away from the abstract debates over institutional norms to focus on tangible outcomes such as arrest records and national crime statistics under the current administration. By emphasizing a reduction in crime, Patel attempted to redefine competence not through the lens of bureaucratic process, but through the lens of public safety results. This tactical shift in the argument seeks to appeal to a constituency that prioritizes law and order over the intricacies of administrative law or departmental tradition. It presents a narrative where the effectiveness of a leader is measured by the safety of the streets rather than the approval of the Washington establishment. The redirection of FBI resources toward immigration enforcement has become a primary battlefield for these competing philosophies of national security. Crockett argued that shifting the Bureau's focus to the southern border detracts from its essential mission of combating domestic terrorism and sophisticated criminal enterprises. She specifically highlighted the perceived failure to sufficiently address the rise of white supremacist extremism, which many intelligence assessments have identified as a top-tier domestic threat. From this perspective, the focus on immigration is seen as a political maneuver designed to align the agency's work with the president's most prominent campaign promises. This reallocation of manpower and funding is not merely a logistical change, but a profound statement on what the government considers to be the greatest danger to the Republic. Patel's dismissal of these concerns as mere theatrics highlights the communicative chasm that exists between the executive and the legislative branches in the current era. He framed the push for border security as a fundamental component of national sovereignty that falls squarely within the FBI's broader mandate to protect the United States. This clash illustrates how the same set of facts can be interpreted through vastly different ideological prisms, leading to a total breakdown in consensus on national priorities. While the legislature seeks to hold the Bureau to its traditional mission of investigating domestic hate groups, the executive branch asserts its right to redefine those priorities based on its own mandate. This creates a friction that tests the limits of the checks and balances system intended to prevent any single branch from exerting total control. The professional fate of career officials within the FBI has also become a focal point of this debate, with Crockett raising alarms about the targeting of non-partisan experts. The concern is that an internal purge of experienced personnel who are perceived as disloyal to the current administration could hollow out the agency's institutional memory. If the FBI becomes an environment where political fealty is the primary metric for career advancement, the quality of its investigative work could suffer irreparable harm. This potential transition toward a patronage system threatens the meritocratic foundations that have historically defined federal service in the United States. Such a shift would not only affect current operations but could also deter future generations of talent from entering the public service for fear of political retaliation. Despite the intensity of the criticism, the director's supporters argue that the FBI has long needed a leader willing to challenge the internal status quo. From this viewpoint, the agency had become an insular entity that was too often unaccountable to the elected representatives of the people. Patel's defenders suggest that his outsider status allows him to identify and correct systemic biases that career insiders might be too close to see. This perspective posits that a certain level of political alignment is necessary to ensure that the executive branch can actually implement the policies for which the public voted. It rejects the notion of the FBI as an entirely independent fourth branch of government, asserting instead that it must be responsive to the political will of the president. This ongoing struggle reflects a much larger national conversation about the nature of power and the definition of a neutral institution in a hyper-partisan age. The hearing was not just an interrogation of one man's record, but a reflection of the deep divisions within the American electorate regarding the role of government. For those who align with Crockett, the FBI must remain a fortress of impartiality to prevent the rise of authoritarianism and the erosion of civil liberties. For those who side with Patel, the agency must be an active participant in the administration's agenda to ensure that the law is used to protect the nation's borders and its cultural identity. The resolution of this conflict will likely dictate the trajectory of American federal law enforcement for decades to come. As the session progressed, the language used by both parties became increasingly symbolic of the broader cultural war occurring outside the halls of Congress. Terms like justice, loyalty, and competence have been weaponized, each side imbuing them with radically different meanings to suit their narrative goals. The video of the hearing, which has since circulated widely, serves as a digital monument to this era of intense political fragmentation. It captures a moment where the dialogue has moved beyond policy disagreements into the realm of fundamental existential questions about the state. The intensity of the exchange suggests that neither side is willing to concede ground, as the stakes are viewed as nothing less than the preservation of the American system itself. The debate surrounding the Bureau's tactical shift under Director Patel has increasingly focused on the unprecedented reallocation of federal agents to the southern border. This administrative pivot marks a significant departure from the FBI's traditional emphasis on complex white-collar crime and long-term counterintelligence operations. Critics, led by figures like Representative Crockett, argue that this movement of personnel is not merely a policy adjustment but a fundamental reordering of the national security hierarchy. They contend that by pulling hundreds of special agents from major metropolitan field offices to assist with immigration processing and enforcement, the Bureau is leaving a vacuum in areas that require specialized investigative expertise. This transition has sparked an intense internal and external dialogue about whether the FBI should function as a secondary border security agency or remain focused on its unique mandate to investigate federal crimes that local law enforcement cannot handle. The numbers cited during the hearing reflect a stark reality in which nearly a quarter of the FBI's total manpower has been redirected to support the Department of Homeland Security's initiatives. For institutionalists, this represents an alarming dilution of the Bureau's core competencies, as agents trained in forensic accounting or cyber warfare are now tasked with duties traditionally handled by Border Patrol. This shift is particularly contentious because it occurs at a time when the landscape of domestic threats is becoming more digitized and geographically dispersed. The concern is that while the administration secures a political win by highlighting immigration arrests, the more insidious threats of foreign espionage and systemic financial fraud are being neglected. This trade-off is the primary point of friction for lawmakers who believe the Bureau's primary duty is to protect the interior from complex, organized threats. In his defense, Patel has framed these reassignments as an urgent response to a national emergency, asserting that border security is inseparable from national security. He argues that the flow of fentanyl and the potential for bad actors to cross into the country necessitates an all-hands-on-deck approach from every federal agency. By empowering special agents in charge to prioritize local threats, he claims to be decentralizing power and making the FBI more responsive to the immediate concerns of the American people. This perspective suggests that the traditional silos of federal law enforcement are an outdated relic of a previous era, and that a modern FBI must be flexible enough to tackle whatever the administration deems the most pressing crisis. It is a philosophy that prioritizes executive agility over departmental tradition, a move that his supporters see as long overdue. However, the specific neglect of white supremacist extremism mentioned by Crockett remains one of the most explosive elements of this administrative shift. Legislative oversight committees have pointed to a perceived lack of transparency in how the Bureau now categorizes and tracks domestic terrorism. There are growing fears that by combining various forms of extremism into broader, less specific categories, the FBI may be obscuring the true scale of the threat posed by far-right groups. This lack of granular data makes it difficult for Congress to allocate resources effectively and for the public to hold the agency accountable. When the director appears unfamiliar with high-profile cases of racially motivated violence, it fuels the narrative that the agency is intentionally looking away from threats that might be politically sensitive for the current administration. Beyond the border, the director has championed a series of high-intensity arrest surges, such as Operation Summer Heat, to demonstrate a commitment to reducing violent crime. While these initiatives have resulted in thousands of arrests, they have also sparked a debate about the difference between short-term optics and long-term public safety. Critics argue that these surges often focus on low-level offenders to pad statistics rather than dismantling the leadership of major criminal organizations. This tension highlights a broader disagreement over the metric of success for a federal agency. Is it the raw number of arrests made in a 90-day window, or the successful prosecution of complex conspiracies that take years to build? The current leadership's preference for rapid, visible results marks a clear break from the slow and methodical approach that defined the FBI for much of the late 20th century. The professional culture within the J. Edgar Hoover building has also undergone a dramatic transformation as the new leadership seeks to root out what it calls the deep state. This effort has led to the departure of numerous veteran officials, some of whom were key figures in past investigations involving the executive branch. To the administration's allies, this is a necessary housecleaning to ensure that the Bureau is not being used as a political tool by unelected bureaucrats. To its detractors, it is a purge of the very expertise that ensures the law is applied without fear or favor. The resulting loss of institutional memory could have far-reaching consequences, particularly in specialized fields like counterintelligence where relationships and knowledge are built over decades. The conflict over the FBI's direction is also playing out in the realm of public perception, where the agency's credibility is being tested on both sides of the aisle. For years, the Bureau was one of the most respected institutions in American life, but it has increasingly become a target for partisan attacks from both the left and the right. Patel's leadership is seen by many as a deliberate attempt to reclaim the Bureau's image among a specific segment of the population that feels the agency has been unfairly weaponized against them. By aligning the FBI so closely with the president's personal brand and policy goals, the leadership is betting that public trust can be rebuilt through political loyalty rather than institutional independence. It is a high-stakes gamble that could either redefine the agency for a new century or leave its reputation in tatters. The hearing also touched upon the Bureau's role in investigating political figures and the perceived double standard in how justice is administered. Crockett's questions regarding the handling of sensitive files and the opening of investigations into former officials highlight a fear that the FBI is becoming an instrument of executive retribution. This is perhaps the most dangerous territory for any law enforcement agency in a democracy, as the mere perception of bias can undermine the legitimacy of every action it takes. When the director sidesteps questions about potential investigations into political rivals, it reinforces the suspicion that the agency is no longer operating on a singular standard of justice. This erosion of the perceived wall between the White House and the FBI is what many observers believe poses the greatest long-term threat to the American legal system. Ultimately, the clash between Crockett and Patel is a symptom of a nation that can no longer agree on the basic functions of its most important institutions. The FBI is caught in the middle of a struggle between those who believe in a technocratic, independent civil service and those who believe that every part of the government should be directly accountable to the winner of the last election. This is not just a debate about policy or personnel. It is a debate about the nature of the American Republic itself. As the Bureau continues to navigate these turbulent waters, the decisions made today will serve as the precedent for how federal power is exercised for generations to come. The video of this hearing remains a vital piece of evidence in this ongoing national trial, capturing the moment when the mask of institutional stability was finally pulled away to reveal the raw political struggles beneath. The examination of Director Patel's tenure frequently shifts from broad policy disagreements to the granular handling of high-profile criminal investigations that have captured the national imagination. One of the most contentious points raised during the session involved the Bureau's approach to domestic cases that carry heavy political or social weight, such as the investigations into civil unrest and the tracking of high-level criminal networks. Representative Crockett's line of inquiry suggested that under the current leadership, the FBI has been selective in its transparency, allegedly withholding information on cases that could be politically inconvenient for the executive branch. This perceived opacity is not just a procedural concern but a fundamental breach of the trust required between the legislative branch and the agencies it oversees. When an agency head is accused of guarding the president's interests rather than the public's right to know, the entire architecture of government accountability begins to vibrate with tension. Specific mention was made of the Bureau's handling of the Jeffrey Epstein files and other sensitive records that have long been the subject of public scrutiny. The debate here centers on whether the current administration is using its power to declassify or suppress information based on political utility rather than legal necessity. Patel has positioned himself as a champion of total transparency, often promising to release documents that he claims the deep state has hidden for years to protect its own. However, critics like Crockett argue that this brand of transparency is actually a form of curated disclosure, designed to smear political opponents while protecting allies. This battle over the archives of federal law enforcement represents a new frontier in political warfare, where the past is constantly relitigated to serve the needs of the present. The discussion also veered into the Bureau's response to recent instances of domestic violence and the rhetoric used by public figures that may incite such actions. Crockett's frustration peaked when addressing what she characterized as a double standard in how the FBI monitors different types of political activism. She pointed to instances where left-wing protesters faced rapid federal intervention while certain right-wing figures, even those linked to inflammatory incidents, appeared to remain outside the Bureau's immediate crosshairs. This disparity, if true, would suggest a systemic bias that compromises the FBI's role as an impartial arbiter of justice. By highlighting these specific cases, the Congresswoman sought to paint a picture of an agency that has lost its moral compass and is now navigating by the stars of partisan loyalty. Director Patel countered these accusations by emphasizing the Bureau's successes in dismantling human trafficking rings and the seizure of record amounts of illicit narcotics at points of entry. He argued that the FBI's primary mission is to stop the most direct threats to American lives, which he defines as the physical violence and poisoning of communities through the drug trade. This utilitarian view of justice prioritizes high-volume, high-impact arrests that produce immediate and visible results for the average citizen. To Patel, the concerns about political bias are a distraction from the life-saving work that agents are doing on the ground every day. This rhetorical strategy effectively frames his critics as being out of touch with the fears of ordinary Americans who are more concerned with local crime than with the nuances of federal declassification policy. The hearing further explored the implications of the director's previous roles and his outspoken public statements before taking office. Crockett argued that Patel's history as a vocal critic of the very agency he now leads creates an inherent conflict of interest that demoralizes the rank and file. She suggested that his leadership style is more akin to a hostile takeover than a traditional stewardship, aimed at dismantling the Bureau's independent culture from the inside out. This internal friction is reported to have led to a significant drop in morale within certain specialized units, particularly those involved in counterintelligence and oversight. If the men and women tasked with protecting the nation feel that their leader is fundamentally suspicious of their work, the effectiveness of the entire organization is put at risk. In response, Patel has often characterized himself as a reformer sent to clean up an agency that had grown arrogant and unaccountable. He views the friction not as a sign of failure but as a necessary consequence of meaningful change. From his perspective, the career bureaucrat's resistance to his leadership is proof that he is successfully challenging the status quo. This narrative of the brave outsider fighting against a corrupt establishment is a powerful one, and it resonates deeply with a segment of the public that has grown skeptical of federal institutions. It creates a dynamic where any criticism from within the agency or from Congress is interpreted by his supporters as evidence that he is on the right track, further entrenching the partisan divide. The technical aspects of the Bureau's investigative methods, particularly in the realm of digital surveillance and the use of FISA warrants, also came under the microscope. There were intense exchanges regarding whether the FBI has corrected the procedural errors that led to past controversies, or if the new leadership is merely using those same tools against a different set of targets. Crockett raised concerns that the current administration might be expanding the use of surveillance to monitor domestic groups that disagree with its policies. This highlights a recurring theme in American history: the fear that the massive power of the federal government, once unleashed, is rarely contained by the boundaries of law or ethics when a determined leader is at the helm. As the hearing moved toward its conclusion, the focus returned to the central question of the FBI's constitutional role. Is it a neutral enforcement body, or is it a tool for the executive to carry out its mandate? The dialogue between Crockett and Patel suggests that there is no longer a shared answer to this question. The very definition of justice has become a partisan commodity, with each side claiming the exclusive right to interpret the law. This collapse of consensus is perhaps the most significant revelation of the entire proceeding, signaling a period of profound instability for the American legal system. The video of this encounter serves as a stark reminder that institutions are only as strong as the people who lead them and the norms that those leaders choose to uphold. The shockwaves from the Bureau's domestic restructuring have reached far beyond the American coastline, vibrating through the sensitive corridors of global intelligence alliances. For decades, the FBI has served as a cornerstone of the Five Eyes Partnership, a clandestine network of trust connecting the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. However, the hearing highlighted a growing sense of unease among these historic allies, who fear that the Bureau's shift toward a populist political agenda may compromise the sanctity of shared secrets. When Representative Crockett questioned the director's commitment to these traditional ties, she touched upon reports of sudden budget cuts to long-standing overseas surveillance posts. This perceived retreat from global responsibilities suggests a new era of isolationism where the Bureau's international footprint is being measured by political loyalty rather than collective security. The concern is that if the FBI becomes an unpredictable partner, the entire infrastructure of global counterintelligence could begin to fracture at its most critical joints. Central to this international friction is the reported tension between Director Patel and leaders of allied intelligence agencies, such as the United Kingdom's MI5. Leaked assessments have painted a troubling picture of broken verbal commitments and the abrupt withdrawal of personnel from joint operations that were deemed essential for monitoring foreign threats. These moves are often justified by the current leadership as necessary cost-cutting measures intended to redirect funds toward domestic priorities like border security and violent crime. Yet, for those steeped in the world of espionage, these cuts are viewed as a reckless dismantling of the very early warning systems that prevent global catastrophes. The loss of a single specialized post in a city like London or Canberra is not just a line item in a budget. It is a blind spot in the eyes of the Western world. This realignment has also altered the FBI's approach to the burgeoning threat of transnational cybercrime and the complex web of fentanyl distribution. While Patel has embarked on high-profile diplomatic tours to regions like Tokyo, Seoul, and even Beijing, his critics argue that these visits are more about optics than substantive cooperation. They point to a disconnect between the director's public warnings about the Chinese espionage threat and his simultaneous decision to reassign thousands of agents away from counterintelligence units. This paradox creates a credibility gap on the world stage, where allies are unsure whether to follow the Bureau's rhetoric or its reality. If the United States appears to be hollowed out by its own internal political struggles, its ability to lead a unified front against sophisticated state actors is fundamentally compromised. The introduction of aggressive new technologies, particularly artificial intelligence, has become another flashpoint in the discussion of the Bureau's future role. Patel has championed the use of AI as a force multiplier to stay ahead of bad actors, framing it as an essential tool for a modern, leaner agency. However, this technological push has raised significant concerns about the potential for automated bias and the erosion of privacy standards, both at home and abroad. International partners, many of whom operate under stricter data protection regimes, are increasingly wary of how the FBI might utilize shared data within these new AI frameworks. The fear is that a politically driven FBI could use advanced surveillance tools to target dissidents or political rivals across borders, a move that would violate the foundational principles of the alliances that have stood since the end of the Second World War. Despite these criticisms, supporters of the current direction argue that a radical rethink of international cooperation is long overdue. They contend that the United States has for too long carried a disproportionate burden of global security, and that the FBI must focus on threats that directly impact the American taxpayer. From this perspective, the decentralization of the Bureau and the focus on immediate domestic harms are signs of a healthy democracy reasserting its own interests over the desires of a globalist elite. This worldview posits that the FBI's primary loyalty should not be to a nebulous international community, but to the specific security mandates of the elected executive. This fundamental disagreement on the Bureau's purpose ensures that every administrative move will continue to be viewed through a lens of suspicion and high-stakes political conflict. The concluding chapter of the confrontation between Representative Jasmine Crockett and Director Kash Patel marks more than just the end of a legislative session. It signals a profound transformation in the American civic religion. For nearly a century, the Federal Bureau of Investigation has occupied a unique, albeit complicated, space in the national consciousness as the ultimate arbiter of federal law. However, the events of early 2026 have laid bare a reality where the Bureau is no longer seen as a monolithic entity of impartial justice, but as a contested territory in a broader ideological war. When Crockett articulated her concerns, she was speaking for a segment of the population that views the current trajectory as a terminal threat to the separation of powers. This perspective holds that once a domestic intelligence agency is tethered to the personal loyalty of a single leader, the delicate machinery of democracy begins to grind toward an authoritarian halt. The discourse has shifted from whether the FBI is doing its job well to whether the FBI, as we have known it, can even continue to exist in a hyperpolarized environment. This erosion of institutional neutrality is perhaps the most significant casualty of the current political era. In the past, the Hoover legacy, despite its many flaws and historical overreaches, at least maintained a veneer of independence from the day-to-day whims of the West Wing. The new paradigm championed by Patel suggests that such independence was always a myth, a deep state fabrication designed to protect unelected officials from the will of the people. By leaning into this narrative, the leadership has fundamentally rewired the expectations of what a federal agency should be. If the public begins to accept that law enforcement is naturally partisan, then the very concept of equal justice under law becomes an empty slogan. This shift impacts everything from jury selection to the public's willingness to cooperate with federal agents, as every action taken by the Bureau is now filtered through a lens of political suspicion. The debate over the unitary executive theory has moved from the fringes of legal academia to the center of FBI operations. This theory posits that the president has the absolute authority to direct all executive branch officials, effectively removing the traditional firewalls that have protected the Department of Justice from political interference. During the hearing, the tension between this legal theory and the practical necessity of an independent judiciary was on full display. Crockett's insistence on professional experience and nonpartisan tenure reflects an older, institutionalist view that federal service is a calling that transcends the four-year cycles of the presidency. Conversely, Patel's approach treats the Bureau as a direct instrument of the president's mandate, arguing that anything less is a subversion of the voter's intent. This conflict is not just about one director or one congresswoman. It is a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the American Republic itself. The demographic and cultural shifts within the J. Edgar Hoover building are equally consequential. As veteran agents who came of age during the post-Watergate era depart, they are being replaced by a new generation of investigators who have only known an environment of intense political combat. This change in the rank and file could lead to a permanent shift in the Bureau's internal culture. There is a growing concern that the specialized units, those handling the most sensitive counterintelligence and public corruption cases, will be the most affected by this ideological turnover. If these units lose their reputation for objectivity, the United States may find itself unable to conduct credible investigations into its own government, leading to a cycle of corruption and retribution that characterizes many declining democracies. The loss of institutional memory is not a temporary setback. It is a structural weakening of the nation's internal defenses. Furthermore, the hearing touched upon the chilling effect that political appointments can have on whistleblowers and internal dissent. In a healthy institution, Professional disagreement is a safeguard against error and overreach. However, when the leadership prizes loyalty above all else, those who raise concerns are often marginalized or removed. Crockett's pointed questions about the treatment of career officials suggest a climate of fear that may be stifling the very expertise the nation relies on to stay safe. If the FBI becomes an echo chamber for the executive branch, it loses its ability to speak truth to power, a role that is essential for preventing the kind of abuses that have marred the history of federal law enforcement in the past. This internal silence is the precursor to external failure, as the agency becomes blinded by its own political biases. The role of the media in shaping the public perception of this hearing cannot be overstated. In an age of algorithmic curation, the exchange between Crockett and Patel was sliced into thousands of short, viral clips, each serving as evidence for a pre-existing worldview. For those who see Patel as a hero, the clip showed a bold reformer standing up to an out-of-touch establishment. For those who side with Crockett, the same footage showed a dangerous partisan evading accountability. This choose-your-own reality dynamic makes it impossible to have a unified national conversation about the FBI's future. The video of the hearing, which should have been a tool for public education, instead became fuel for the fire of national division. As 2026 progresses, the ability of any federal institution to command broad public respect seems to be slipping away, replaced by a series of competing tribal loyalties. As we look toward the future, the precedents set during this period will likely govern the exercise of federal power for decades. If the current model of a politically responsive FBI is allowed to stand, every future president, regardless of party, will feel empowered to use the Bureau as a tool for their own agenda. We are witnessing the dismantling of the neutral expert model of governance, replaced by a spoil system that rewards fealty over competence. This is a high-stakes gamble with the stability of the American legal system. The question remains, can a democracy survive if its primary law enforcement agency is no longer trusted by half of the population? The answer to that question will not be found in a single hearing, but in the cumulative actions of the men and women who wear the FBI badge in the coming years. The ultimate legacy of the Crockett-Patel confrontation may be its role as a mirror, reflecting the deep-seated anxieties of a nation that no longer agrees on what it means to be secure. For some, security is found in a strong leader who uses the law to enforce a specific cultural and political vision. For others, security is found in the law itself, acting as a check on the impulses of any leader. These two visions are currently in direct collision, and the FBI is the primary battlefield. The resolution of this struggle will dictate the trajectory of American governance into the mid-21st century. As the hearing adjourned, the sense of resolution was nowhere to be found, replaced instead by a grim realization that the battle for the soul of the Bureau has only just begun. In conclusion, the discourse surrounding Kash Patel's leadership and Jasmine Crockett's fierce opposition represents a defining moment in the history of the American executive branch. It is a story of power, loyalty, and the fragile nature of democratic institutions. By analyzing this event through a neutral lens, we can see the complex motivations on both sides, a desire for accountability on one hand, and a push for radical reform on the other. However, beneath the political theatre lies a much darker possibility, the permanent loss of a shared standard of justice. As the nation moves forward, the record of this hearing will stand as a testament to a time when the fundamental pillars of the Republic were tested like never before. The outcome of this test will determine whether the United States remains a nation of laws or becomes a nation of men.